All right, Trouble, say good morning, Gemar Chasima. Okay. Gemar Chasima Tova. Sorry, we're getting started a few moments late. I apologize. We'll say, let us begin. Begin by thanking. Thank you, Moshe. Thank you. Begin by thanking our sponsors for this morning share. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for Tishrei, Dr. Linda Weinberg, Sarah and Ricky Gratz, Julia, Rena, and Eve, in loving memory of their husband, father, and Zeda. Dr. Paul Weinberg, Peretz Moshe, Ben Avram David. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Tishrei, Ayal and Sarah Steinberg, in the Schus of Refuah Shalema for Shulamis Bas Susha, Adam and Yudit Ben Zev, in the Zechus of all of our Tfilos being Niskabel. To thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Hillary Jacobson Kent and Akiva Kent, in memory of Mordechai Menashe ben Shmaryo, Nathan and Beth Adler, in memory of Ben Adler, Achaver Baruch Mordechai, Ben Morino Rab Nasan, Zichron Livracha, and Said and Simahakin for Refuah Shlema for their granddaughter, Talia Miriam Bas Orli Yehudit. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, in Meretz Hashem, all of the neshama should have an aliyah, and all of those who require a refuah should have one together with Kol Cholei Yisrael. Both say, let us begin. A lot to do today. Today's daf is Pei Daled 84. We are picking up in Meretz Hashem on the bottom of Pei Gimel Amud Beis. Baruch Hashem. We covered good ground over Yantiv. We left off at the two dots. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel Omer. So both say, the Gemara says, remember, the Gemara is quoting the Mishnah now of Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. And Rabbi Shimon Gamliel said in the Mishnah, just finding the quotation, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel said as follows. This was on the last case, where a husband writes to his wife, Din udvaram eli benichsayich, o beperosehen, o bepere perosehen, bechayech o bimoseich. So Rabbi say here, essentially, he's relinquishing rights to everything, right? To the actual property, to the peros, to the pere perosehen, during her lifetime, as well as even after her death. So ultimately, again, the Mishnah said that halacha l'maisa, it's effective. He's relinquished everything. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel said, no, if she dies, he inherits her. Why? Because ultimately, again, that part of the stipulation is void. Because that is masna amasha kasav batorah. He's going ahead and stipulating in a way that contradicts Torah law, since Torah law says that a husband inherits his wife. And any time you make a Tanai, which runs contrary to the biblical law, the Tanai is batal. Tanai is batal. So it says the Gemara, here we go. Amar Rav, halach Reb Shimon Gamliel, v'lo mitamei. Rav says the halacha in fact follows Reb Shimon Gamliel, but not for his reasoning. Not for his reasoning. So the Gemara says, what does that mean? My halacha Reb Shimon Gamliel v'lo mitamei. But say, what does that statement mean? So again, just very simply, Reb Shimon Gamliel essentially says like this: you can make a Tanai to go ahead and forego any rights you have in your wife's property. That's your right. The one thing you can't do is make a Tanai that says you will not inherit her. Because if you do that, you're making a Tanai which runs contrary to biblical law. Anytime you make a Tanai contrary to biblical law, the Tanai is batal. Comes Rav says the halacha follows Rav Shimon Gamliel, but not for his reasoning. Okay, what does that mean? So let's analyze. Say if we want to say the halacha follows Rav Shimon Gamliel, namely that even if you made a Tanai not to inherit your wife upon her death, that you still inherit her. So the Gemara says, "V'lav mitamei di Rav Shimon Gamliel savar masna mashakasa bator tino batal v'Rav savar tino kayim." They both say maybe what Rav is saying is like this: the halacha follows Rav Shimon Gamliel, but not for his reasoning. Namely, what Rav Shimon Gamliel holds that masna amasha kasav batorah, if you make a Tanai which runs contrary to biblical law, what's the halacha? Your Tanai is batal. Whereas Rav holds that your Tanai works. Rav says you can make a Tanai which runs contrary to biblical law. Is that true? The Gemara is from Rav Savar B'Tzrao Kayim V'Kasavar Yerushas Habal D'Rabanan. Furthermore, Rav holds that the idea that a husband inherits his wife, that idea is a din d'Rabanan. The Chachamim asu chizuk l'divrei yosem mishal Torah, and the Chachamim will say sometimes we're more machmir with their own laws than biblical law. So we'll say, so watch just what happened over here, just to follow the progression very quickly. So essentially, Rav is coming along and saying like this: the halacha follows Rav Shimon Gamliel. So we'll say, so what's the halacha? What's the halacha? A husband makes a Tanai not to get any benefit from his wife's property, the peros, during her lifetime and after her death. What's the halacha? The Tanai works when? When? During her lifetime, but when she dies, he inherits her. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel's logic is because you can't make a Tanai which runs contrary to biblical law. Rav comes along and says, the halacha follows Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, but not for his reasoning. So we'll say, so what does that mean? So maybe that means that according to Rav says like this. Number one, Rav holds that if you make a Tanai which runs contrary to biblical law, it does work. Furthermore, again, Rav holds that the ability for a husband to inherit his wife, or the right that a husband has to inherit his wife, is only midrabanan. But even though it's drabanan, sometimes Chazal made their own halachas even stronger than da'oraisas. So Rav is agreeing with the bottom line of Shimon Gamliel, but disagreeing ultimately again as to how they got there. Fine. To which the Gemara says, top of Peidal, v'savar Rav to know Kayim. V'savar Rav to know Kayim. Let's say it's incredible. No, during 2 days of Yontiv, we got a whole blot done. There must be a special siyata d'shmaya by Yontiv that I don't have during the week. Okay, in any event, the Gemara says as follows. V'savar Rav to know Kayim. Does Rav hold that halacha l'maisa again? The Tanai is Kayim, right? Does Rav hold that halacha l'maisa again? That if you make a Tanai which runs contrary to biblical law, the Tanai works. V'ha itmar, both says fascinating case. Homer l'chavero almanas she'in lach alai ona. Both listen to this case. Let's say I sell Ruvain an item, and I say to Ruvain, this sale will be valid on the condition that you have no claims of ona against me. Both say, what's halachos of ona? Overcharging, undercharging. Remember again. So I say to Ruvain, this sale is valid as long as you have no claims of ona against me. What's the halacha? Rav Amar Yeshal Avona, Ushmuel Amar Ein Lo Alavana. So interesting if Shmuel holds that it works. Ultimately, again, Rav says it doesn't work. So what do you see from here? That Rav holds Masna Amash Shakasov Batorah to no batel. Rav, in fact, holds that when you go ahead and you make a Tanai which runs contrary to biblical law, the Tanai is batel. Okay, so he will say that's good news. He's agreeing with Rav Shimon Gamliel in that respect. Ella, so we'll say, so remember, we're trying to, this is actually one of these great discussions where the bottom line is clear and absolute, right? Everyone's agreeing on the bottom line. What's interesting is this statement of Rav, where Rav comes along and says that halacha l'maisa, again, the halacha falls with Shimon Gamliel, but not because of his reasoning. That's the piece we're trying to figure out. Ella, halacha, k'Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, do'amar hamasna amash shakasov batorah to na'o batel, v'lav mitame. Rather, again, we mean like this. The halacha is Reb Shimon Gamliel, who holds that if you make a Tanai which runs contrary to biblical law, your Tanai is batal, v'lav mitame, but not according to his reasoning. Why so? Reb Shimon Gamliel, savar, meisi yirashena. Reb Shimon Gamliel holds that halacha l'maisa, even when the husband makes the Tanai, that he's not going to get any benefit from her property, peiros, during her lifetime and after her death. So Reb Shimon Gamliel holds that the husband still inherits his wife because the Tanai is batal. The Rav savar meisa lo yirashena. Rav, on the other hand, holds that no, when the wife dies, the husband does not inherit her. Well, one second. If that's the case, hay mitame v'lo kehilchasehu. Then ultimately, again, Rav is subscribing to the idea of Reb Shimon Gamliel, but ultimately, again, not the bottom line halacha. Ella halacha k'Reb Shimon Gamliel da'amar imeise yirashena v'lav mitame. Rather, Rav is saying like this. The halacha actually follows Reb Shimon Gamliel, but again, not in accordance with the reasoning. How so? Di'ilu Reb Shimon Gamliel savar b'da'oraisa t'na'u batel habidrabanan t'na'u kayim. Very interesting, I will say. Reb Shimon holds like this. If you make a Tanai which runs contrary to biblical law, your Tanai is batel. What happens if you make a Tanai which runs contrary to rabbinic law? What's the halacha? Reb Shimon holds that the Tanai is kayim. So the Gemara says, Rav savar afilu b'drabanan t'na'u batel. We'll say Rav goes a step further, and Rav actually holds that even if you make a Tanai which runs contrary to what? Contrary to rabbinic law, your Tanai is batel as well. Well, if that's the case, hai kitame ukehilchaseu. Then I will say, in reality, then Rav is fully agreeing with Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. In other words, the fact that he adds on something additional, he's still agreeing with the Ikra Halach Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. The Rav Mosifu, Rav just adding something else on. Ella, so I'll say, again, I just want to point out, we're just trying to figure out, Rav made an interesting statement. Rav said, the halacha follows Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, but not his reasoning. So the bottom line is correct, but not his reasoning. We're trying to figure out, what does that mean? So the Gemara says, Ella, halacha Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, the Amar Imesi Rashena. So we'll say, so again, Rav meant like this. The halacha follows Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, namely, that if the husband made the Tanai not to get any benefit from his wife's property, peiros, during her lifetime, during her death, during her lifetime, ultimately the Tanai works. After her death, the Tanai no longer works. Tano batal. So the Gemara says, "V'lav mitame." Here we go. The ila Rabbi Gamliel Savar Yerushas Habal Da'araisa. Because remember again, Rabbi Gamliel holds that the ability or the right that a husband has to inherit his wife is a biblical right. And therefore, when the husband goes in and makes a Tanai that he's not going to inherit, he's masna amasha kasav batora. That's what Rabbi Gamliel holds. The Rav Sava, Rav on the other hand holds, Yerushas Habal Dirabanan. So we'll listen to this. Here's where Rav disagrees. Rav holds that halacha l'maisa, the ability or the right that a husband has that he inherits his wife, is not daraisa. It's dirabanan. But watch this. The chachamim asu chizik l'divrayim kishal Torah. But I will say the chachamim went ahead and made their law just as strict as a doraisa. So now Rabbi say, here we go. So now I understand this. So Rav says, the halacha of Rav Shimon Gamliel, namely, that if you make a Tanai not to inherit your wife, such a Tanai is batal. So Rav agrees with that. What does he disagree? He disagrees with the reasoning of Shimon Gamliel. Rav Shimon Gamliel says the reason why the Tanai is batal is why? Because such a Tanai, because such a right, the right of inheritance, is doraisa. If you make a Tanai that's masna amasha kasav batora, you're making a Tanai which runs contrary to biblical law. Anytime you make a Tanai which runs contrary to biblical law, what's the halacha? Your Tanai is batal. So Rav says, I agree with your bottom line halacha, but disagree with your reasoning. Rav holds that a husband's right to inherit his wife is not d'oraisa. It's d'Rabbanan. But yet, if this is a case where Chazal made their enactment just as strict as biblical law. So I'll agree with the bottom line, halacha Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, but disagree with your mechanism or disagree with your reasoning. Fascinating. One second. The Rav Savar Yerusha Saval D'Rabbanan. Is that true? Rav holds that a husband's ability or a husband's right to inherit his wife is only a D'Rabbanan. V'hatanan, we learned, Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka Omer, Hayoresh es ishto yachser libnei mishpacha. So I'll say it's an interesting case. Rabbi Yochanan Baruch says like this: a husband inherits his wife. So I will say, so what should he do during Yovel? Very interesting. During Yovel, he has to go ahead and return the property to his wife's family. But ultimately, again, they have to pay him back. So, interesting halacha. So a husband inherits his wife. Yovel comes, we'll say, well, Yovel, you're 50, right? The Jubilee year, right? You're 50. What happens during Yovel? All property goes back to original owners. So Rabbi Yochanan Baruch says like this, right? Reuven was married to Rachel. Rachel died. Reuven inherited his wife. Comes Yovel. He has to give the property back to her family, but ultimately they pay him some price for the property. Favinan ba. And we asked about this. My kasavar, I don't understand. What's going on over here? If you hold that Yerusha's right, husband's ability to inherit his wife is a daraisa, then why does he have to give it back to his wife's family at Yovel? See, I will say, I just want to point out, inheritance does not revert back at Yovel, right? Because inheritance is not considered to be transactional. Only property purchases, right, conveyances revert back. But usually, again, inheritance does not revert back. So I don't understand, why is a husband giving back the inheritance from his wife during Yovel? If you hold it ultimately, again, it's daraisa, it shouldn't go back. V'i drabanan, And if it's only d'Rabbanan, in other words, if you hold me d'Rabbanan, a husband inherits his wife, but not d'Oraisa, then it should go back at Yovel. And why should the husband get any money from his wife's family? So Rav says, we'll say Rav interprets this, the Olam Sharishasa Eshto Beisakvaras. I will say this is interesting. What did the husband inherit from his wife? An unusual inheritance. A cemetery. A cemetery. Right? He inherits a cemetery. They both say, now listen to this. So Rav says like this. Rav is saying like this. Really, when a husband inherits his wife, such Yerusha is Doraisa. So why does he have to give it back to her family? Because he inherited a cemetery. Mishum Pigam Mishpacha. I will say it was, I don't know, common, but sometimes family had cemeteries, right? What was the point of a family cemetery? Take a wild guess, right? To bury the family in it. It was considered to be something not nice, like a degradation for the mishpacha, for outsiders to be buried in a family cemetery. So therefore, again, in the specific case of family cemetery, Chazal said, even though the husband's inheritance of his wife is a da'oraisa, comes Yovel, give back the cemetery to the wife's family. So therefore, Allah he gives it back, even though really he owns it. But because again it's pegam b'shach, it's not nice for the family, give it back. Ultimately, again, they're going to pay him for it. However, what money could they subtract from the amount they pay him? So demei kever ishto. So we'll say, interestingly enough, the amount they could subtract is what? The value of his wife's grave. Meaning what? Since a husband has an obligation to go ahead and bury his wife, therefore they can subtract out that amount. Kidisanya, as we learned, hamocher kivro v'derech kivro ma'amado u'makom espedo ba'emenei mishpacha v'kovrin osa ba'karcha mishum pegam mishpacha. So we'll say, interestingly enough, halacha l'maisa, if a person sells off his grave, so let's say I have a family, I have a portion in a family plot, I sell off my grave, or again I sell off derech to the grave, the pathway to the grave, or ultimately again there's a spot for my eulogy or a spot for my ma'amad, and I sell off these places. Interestingly enough, if I die, my family has the right to seize these things from the purchaser and bury me there. Why? Because I will say, again, to have someone not of the family buried in a family plot is considered to be a pegam mishpacha. Good, I will say, what do we see from here? It appears that Rav holds that a husband's inheritance of his wife is a d'oraisa, not a d'Rabbanan, to which the Gemara says, Rav l'tamid Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroga kamerlei v'leilu svirlei. So Rav, in reality, was just saying in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroga, but he does not agree with it. So therefore, I will say what comes out of here is as follows: a fundamental machlokes, Rav and Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, about a husband's right to inherit his wife. Everyone agrees that a husband inherits his wife. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel holds that is a din d'oraisa. Rav holds that it's a din d'Rabbanan. Therefore, again, in the Mishnah's case, where the husband writes, din udvarim eli b'nechsayich, o b'peiros saying, b'chayech ula'achar moseich, essentially gives up all rights, during her lifetime and her death. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel holds that Allah Chalamayse still inherits her. Why does he inherit her? Because the right of a husband to inherit his wife is a biblical right. You can't go ahead and make a Tanai which runs contrary to a biblical right, and if you do, the Tanai is batal. Rav says, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, I agree with you, but not because you're reasoning. I hold a husband's right to inherit his wife is what? A d'Rabbanan, but Chachamim asu chizuk l'divreim kishal Torah. The rabbis made their law as stringent as biblical law. And therefore, again, I will agree with you that in this case, when the husband makes a Tanai not to inherit his wife, the Tanai does not work. Beautiful. Mishnah. Misha meis v'niach ishu balchov was an interesting case. The Yarshin, a guy dies, we'll call him Ruvain. Ruvain dies. And when Ruvain dies, what happens? He leaves behind a wife, Rachel. Ubalchov, he also leaves behind some debts. The Yarshin, and inheritors. So he leaves behind a wife, kids, and debtors. It's like a regular day, right? And I say, so a wife, debtor, and kids. So I will say, so the Gemara says as follows. So what's that? I will say, v'hayala pikadon, o milva biyad l'cheir. Now I will say, Ruvain goes ahead and now has a pikadon. Pikadon means, collateral, an object, right? So he leaves behind property that's in the possession of others, or ultimately, again, a milva, somebody owes him money. So in other words, he leaves behind assets which are currently in the hands of someone else. In other words, Rabbi say they're not in the estate right now. In other words, they're part of the estate, they're owed to the estate, but not in the estate. So we'll say, what's the shaila? What's the shaila? Who gets the money? Who gets the money? Rabbi Tarfon says, Yinasnu l'kol shel Shabbat. Rabbi Tarfon says, you give it to the weakest position creditor. Okay, so it's not clear who that refers to. We'll see in the Gemara. Rabbi Akiva says, there's no rachmanis in din. No rachmanis in din. So who do you give it to? Eli Yinasnu liyarshin. Rather, Rabbi Akiva says, everything goes to the inheritors, to the estate. Shekulan tzrichen shavua, then yarshin tzrichen shavua. Because we'll say, interestingly enough, an almana, right, a widow, if she wants to collect from the estate, she needs to collect with a shvua, right? What's the shvua, Rabbi? Say the shvua is that she has not been paid out during her husband's lifetime. Similarly, any creditors want to collect from the estate also could only collect with a shvua. The only people who don't need a shvua, who don't need an oath to collect from the estate or to inherit the estate, are the yisomim. So Rabbi Akiva says essentially the yisomim have the strongest position, and therefore the default is everything comes to them. When we say everything comes to them, everything comes back to the estate. Hiniach peros telushim in akarka. If let's say Reuven died and he left behind again detached produce, kol hakodem zacha bahen. Whichever one of the creditors acquires them first, acquires them. Zachsa isha yosem Kesuvos. What happens if the woman acquired detached produce and she acquired detached produce in excess of the value of her ksuva, or Baal Chov Yosra Al Chovo, or for that matter, again, the creditor takes detached produce more than the value of his loan? What's the halacha? So Hamosar, what do you do with the excess? Rabbi Tarfon says, give it to the weakest position creditor. Rabbi Akiva says, there's no rachmanis in judgment. Rather, again, I'll say any amount of excess of detached produce automatically goes to the inheritors. Why? Shekulam tzrichen shvua. All of them require a shvua to collect from the estate of Reuven. Ve'in hayarshin tzrichen shvua. But ultimately, again, inheritors do not require a shvua. Beautiful. Says the Gemara. Lama li lemisni milva. Lama li lemisni pikada. So let's remember again. The Mishnah begins with a statement, Reuven dies, he leaves behind a wife, children, or I should say a wife, a creditor, right, and children. And he also has in his possession, right, a milva, a loan, which means again someone owes him money, or a pikadon. He deposited an object with someone else. So in other words, there's money coming to the estate. It's not currently in possession, but it's coming to the estate. So the Gemara says, why do you need both the case of he's owed a loan and a pikadon? Why do you need both of those cases? To which the Gemara says, I'll tell you why. If it would have just said a loan, that's Rabbi Tarfon says, give it to the weakest position, right? To the weakest position, right? Why? Because a milva is not considered to be owned by the estate. There's a concept that when you lend money, that money becomes that money becomes owned by the debtor, and it's in the debtor's possession. I would have said that's the case. Rabbi Tarfon says that goes to the weakest position creditor of the estate. However, ava pikadon di ise be'ene ema modi le Rabbi Akiva. I will say, but a pikadon ultimately, again, which is extant, right? Ultimately, that should really be, he would agree with Rabbi Akiva, and that would become the property of the Yarshim, right? V'itana baha, b'hakram Akiva, and it would have just said, ultimately, again, the case of Pikadon, that's Rabbi Akiva holds his position. Ava bahach, modi le Rabbi Tarfon. But again, perhaps in the case of Hava, he would agree with Rabbi Tarfon, therefore I need both cases. Beautiful. So we'll say, so again, Maila Kosha. So we'll say, let's go back. Let's just look at this through the lens of the first case. Reuven's married to Rachel, right? Reuven dies. There are three people who line up for a collection after Reuven's levaya. They wait till after the levaya, right? Or at least the first shovelful, right? So I'll say, so again, now what happens? Who are the three people? A wife who wants her ksuva, right? A creditor, right? Who wants repayment of his debt, and Yershim, children, right? Now, children aren't coming obviously in satisfaction of a specific debt, but Lamaisa, they're coming along claiming their inheritance. So who gets the? And now remember again, the estate is owed both a milveh or a pikadon, right? A loan, so someone owes Ruvain money, or someone has a pikadon from Ruvain. Okay, so I'll say, so who, what's the order? Who gets it? Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Tarfon says, give it to the weakest position, right? So amongst the wife, creditor, children, give it to the weakest position. Rabbi Akiva says, there's no rachmanis here. Everything goes to the yarshim. Everything goes to the estate. Okay, so says the Gemara, my koshel, the koshel. Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Chanina Amar, the koshel shabaraya means the one who has the weakest proof, the weakest shtar. So we'll say Rashi understands this to mean ultimately lemi sheshtara mu'uchar, whoever has the latest claim. The latest claim. So we'll say, in other words, if you look at this, so you have children, a wife, and a creditor. So whose claim is latest? Whoever has the latest claim, in other words, whoever came on the scene last, that's considered to be the person with the weakest claim. Rabbi Yochanan says, no, it means to the ksuva of the wife. Why? Mishum china. So we'll say it's actually interesting. We have a vested interest in paying off a wife first. Why? Because we want women to feel secure entering into marriage. So essentially, how do you make a woman feel secure entering into marriage? Well, number one, you provide for her in marriage, and what else do you do? In the event of death or divorce, what does she become? A first position creditor. So the Gemara says that's what it means, koshel, the weakest one. In other words, we give her first rights. Kitanai, is machlokes tanai. Rabbi Yomi Omer, the koshel shabaraya, v'hu kasher. Rabbi Elazar Omer, the Kesuvos isha mishum china. Okay, so there's a machlokes Rabbi say in Rabbi Tarfon. What does Rabbi Tarfon mean when he says give it to the weakest one? Weakest one could either be the one with the latest claim, right? Chronologically, the latest claim, or ultimately, again, no, it just means Kesuvos isha, because halacha l'maisa, again, we want her to feel secure as a first position creditor. Incredible. So the Gemara says as follows, hiniach piras atlushin. So I'll say, so remember again, the next case in Mishnah was like this. Ruvain dies, and what happens? He left detached produce. So we'll say, so now what happens with detached produce? Kol hakodim zacha bahem. Whoever gets there first, out of all of the creditors, right? So we'll say, so now remember again, so let's say wife comes, creditor comes, children comes. So then we'll say, the Gemara said, Rabbi Akiva. Now remember, then the Mishnah says, what happens if, let's say, the various people seized of detached produce and there was excess? Who does the excess go to? So once again, Rabbi Tarfon said to the weakest one. Rabbi Akiva said, no, there's no Rachmanas Hovir. Everything comes to the estate. Everything comes to the orphans. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Akiva, my area Mosar. Why does Rabbi Akiva have to deal with excess? Kulhu nami diyashinavu. Rabbi say, 1 second. According to Rabbi Akiva, in a case, Rabbi say, it makes it sound like that when there's detached produce, everyone has rights. But that's not true. According to Rabbi Akiva, whenever Ruvain dies, Rabbi say, who does the estate go to? Right? Remember again, according to Rabbi Akiva, the way this works is like this. Ruvain dies, what happens with the estate? Yarshim. Automatically becomes the possession of the inheritors. Now, once the Yarshim own it, now we have to settle the estate. Now there are different things. You're supposed to say, this is a fundamental machlokes. In Rabbi Tarfon's model, it's really fascinating. In Rabbi Tarfon's model, Ruvain dies, it's possible that what's going to happen, wife is going to come along, or some other lower position is going to come along and seize stuff from the estate. And Rabbi Akiva's model, no. Ruvain dies, automatic transition of the estate to the Yarshim. That's how it works. Okay, now the Yarshim own the estate. Now people are coming to the estate and they're saying, you owe me this, you owe me that. Then there's a mechanism to satisfy these debts. According to Rabbi Akiva, what do you mean the excess of the detached produce? The detached produce in its entirety becomes the possession of the Yarshim, to which the Gemara says, Einachinami, you're right. Va'aydam Rabbi Tarfon Mosar, Tana ihu nami Mosar. Since Rabbi Tarfon used lashon of Mosar, of excess, Rabbi Akiva also said excess. But in Rabbi Akiva's model, once Ruvain dies, if there's detached produce, that automatically becomes the possession of the children of the inheritors. Amud Beis Rabbi say, Rabbi Akiva, Tfisa lo mahan yiklal. So what's the current Rabbi Akiva? So the Gemara is asking. So we'll say, let's analyze this. This is very interesting. So watch this case. Watch this case in just a moment. Right? So Reuven dies. Right? Reuven dies. What happens? He leaves behind the field. On the field, let's say they just harvested the wheat. So now there's detached produce on the field, on the field. In Rabbi Tarfon's model, Bosai, what happens? So if you could imagine, the widow comes, she grabs wheat, right? Somebody lent Reuven money, he comes, grabs wheat. The children grab wheat. So everybody's grabbing what they want. And then again, if there's excess, then we figure out what to do with the excess. And Rabbi Akiva's model sounds like no one has a right to grab anything. Because who does the detached produce belong to? Who does it belong to? The Yarshim, the children. So now the Gemara says, well, one second. Is that true? That according to Rabbi Akiva, if somebody grabbed, let's say a creditor of Reuven's, grabbed detached produce, would that grabbing of detached produce not work? That's called tfisa. Would tfisa of movable property not work in satisfaction of a debt? Amar Rav Nachman, v'husha tafas michayim. Fascinating. It works. Rabbi said, do you know when grabbing of detached produce works for a creditor? If he did it while Reuven was alive. So Rabbi Akiva would say this, once Reuven dies, everything he owns effectively becomes possession of who? Of the Arshim. But if Reuven had detached produce while he was alive, and Reuven had a creditor, right, who lent him $1,000, and now his creditor wants to come and seize detached produce in satisfaction of a debt, that would work. That would work. Michayim, that would work. Or Rabbi Tarfon, I was according to Rabbi Tarfon, the man chichas. So now listen to this. Now, according to Rabbi Tarfon holds that halacha l'maaseh even after the death of Reuven. So let's play this out. Reuven has a wheat field. It was harvested. Reuven dies. After Reuven's death, according to Rabbi Tarfon, what could happen over here? Wife comes and what could she do? Grab wheat for a ksuva. Creditor comes and what could he do? Grab wheat for satisfaction of the debt. This is fascinating. Where's the wheat? Right? Where's the wheat? Where is the wheat lying? So the Gemara says, listen to this. Ravu Shmuel, and Rabbi said, take a look at Rashi for just a moment. See, what Rabbi Tarfon is asking is like this. We generally assume, that when Reuven dies, what happens to his estate the moment after he dies? What happens? It becomes Yerusha. So it must be that in a case where Rabbi Tarfon is allowing seizure of movable property in satisfaction of other debts, the property must be somewhere where it lends itself to seizure. Because you see, how did I set up the case? I set up, Rabbi says, where was the detached wheat lying? Where was it lying? On the field. Can't be. Why? Because Rabbi say, when Reuven dies, who owns the field? The Yarshim. And Bepashtus, who owns whatever's lying on the field? The Yarshim. So it must be that when Rabbi Tarfon sets up a case that Reuven is dying, or not dying, Reuven died, and now other people have a right to seize movable property in satisfaction of their individual respective debts, that movable property must be somewhere other than the field. So where is it? So we must listen to this. So Rabbi Shmuel da Amri Tarvayu, v'hushet siburin u'munachen b'rshus harabim. Oh, interesting. They both say, where's the property? In public domain. In other words, you can imagine the case, Reuven had taken the field to sell taking the wheat to sell it in the marketplace. He died in the marketplace. So now where is the wheat? The wheat is in Rosh Hashanah. Oh, that's the case Rabbi Tarfon says, if the wife comes along and seizes the wheat in satisfaction of her ksuva, a lender comes along and seizes the wheat in satisfaction of his debt, that could work. Aval besimta lo. I was saying a simta. Now we've had simta. We had supposed to remember simta from our Erevin days. What's a simta? Look at Rashi. Last white line in Rashi. Simta. Karen zaves hasmucha l'rishus harabim ubnei adam ha'osin schora zem zeh b'shakar. Simta is like a quieter corner of the Rosh Hashanah. So it's still called Rosh Hashanah, but it's a bit more private. So I would say if it was red, but if the wheat was in a simta, then ultimately again that would be the possession of the Yarshim, and others would not be able to take it. And Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish say no, even if it was in a simta, others could still want to take it. So I will say a fascinating qualification. It's even Rabbi Tarfon who says that when Reuven dies, a wife, a creditor could come and seize movable property in satisfaction of their debt. That's only if the movable property is not on the karka of the Yarshim. So if it's Rosh Hashanah, they could come and take it. But if it's in Rosh Sayachah, they cannot. So let's watch this. Don Danik Rabbi Tarfon. So one time, Dayonim, paskind like Rabbi Tarfon. Namely, Rabbi say, namely what? Ultimately, again, they allowed the wife or creditor to seize movable property after the death of Ruvain for satisfaction of their individual debts. Va'ahadre Reish Lakish le'uvdemenahu. And Reish Lakish, listen to this. Reish Lakish made them reverse their decision. Right? Reish Lakish said, no, wrong psak. We paskin like Rabbi Akiva. There's no Rachmano. So Rabbi saying, we pass like Rabbi Akiva. When Ruvain dies, what happens to all of his possessions immediately upon death? Become the property of the Yarshim. Okay, wife, you want to collect your ksuva. Debtor, right? Creditors, you want to collect your debt. There's a mechanism, right? You're not without recourse, but right after death, it becomes the possession of the Yarshim. Suddenly, Rabbi Yochanan, Asisa Kishal Torah? Rabbi Yochanan says, wow, you're treating this like a daraisa, that you're literally willing to go ahead and reverse judgments. So we'll say perhaps this is what they're arguing about. Here we go. Demar Savar, one opinion holds that if you make a mistake with an explicit ruling in a Mishnah, that is a reversible decision. Umar Savar Tar b'dvar Mishnah in a choser. The other opinion says no, even if you make a mistake in an explicit ruling in a Mishnah, you don't reverse, and therefore you're going to both say that's the machlokes. No, it's not true. Everyone agrees that if a Beis Din makes a mistake with an explicit ruling of a Mishnah, ultimately, again, the mistake is reversed. It's reversed. We'll say here's machlokes. One says the halacha always follows Rabbi Akiva whenever he's arguing against someone else. But not when he argues against his Rebbe. Umar savar halacha filu me rabo. Others say that halacha even follows Rabbi Akiva even when he argues with his Rebbe. And Rabbi say we're assuming over here that Rabbi Tarfon is Rabbi Akiva's Rebbe. People say the other possibility is everyone agrees that halacha follows Rabbi Akiva when he's arguing with his fellow, but not with his Rebbe. Here's what they're arguing about. Mar Sav Rabbi Tarfon Rabbo Hava. One says Rabbi Tarfon was the Rebbe of Rabbi Akiva. Umar Savar Chaveira Hava. And ultimately one says it wasn't his Rebbe, but rather it was his colleague. The other possibility is the Koli Alma Chaveira Hava. Everyone agrees that Rabbi Tarfon was Rabbi Akiva's colleague. Here's what they're arguing about. Mar Savar Halacha Itmar. Umar Savar Matin Itmar. One said that halacha follows Rabbi Akiva. The other said not that halacha follows Rabbi Akiva, rather we lean like Rabbi Akiva. So also we'll stop over here for today. So again, we're leaving off with this machlokes Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon, namely what happens with an estate when Ruvain dies. According to Rabbi Akiva, everything automatically becomes the possession of the Yarshim, and everything is settled from there. According to Rabbi Tarfon, not true. According to Rabbi Tarfon, we give the property first to the weakest position. What's the definition ultimately again of weakest position? That's a machlokes. Either whoever's claim came later or ksuvas isha. Halach l'maisa. We'll say Mir Hashem. We'll see you tomorrow. Shkoyach.